Large vein coming up from below.
Inferior vena cava.
Inferior vena cava. And another big vein coming down from above.
Superior vena cava.
Superior vena cava. And they converge in the right atrium. And around the fringe of the right atrium is this little frilly thing called the right auricle.
The right what?
Auricle.
Auricle.
And it's the same term as we use for our ear flap. Auricle. It looks kind of like a little ear. But it has a connection with the atria, so it's part of the chamber. The atrium goes into the right ventricle, and the right ventricle kind of wraps around the left, like this. So this is all right ventricle here. And when it contracts, the blood goes out through this.
Pulmonary artery.
That's the pulmonary artery. Okay? So you're going to go behind the heart and then fork and fork and fork again. The blood from the lungs will return via pulmonary veins, and you can see one of them here. Pretty thin walled, you can see the blue right through it. Into the left atrium, which also has auricles. Right?
So is the auricles the fringe, or is it like...
It's this little area right around the fringe of it, right around the edge.
And we have that in humans too? Or just... Okay.
Yeah. It's hard to see because we have so much fat over ours usually. And you'll see the sheep too has a little bit of that.
Okay.
But here's the left ventricle, and it's much more conical shaped, ending in the apex of the heart. In between the two, you can see an interventricular sulcus, the groove. And this is where one of the major coronary arteries runs. The coronary vein by its side. You can see some other coronary arteries running out here. And of course, the coronary arteries source right off the aorta as soon as it's left the heart. So just above the semilunar valve, coronary arteries get first dibs on that blood. And then the aorta, which is right here underneath the pulmonary trunk, is called the ascending aorta. It will then become the aortic arch. And off of the aortic arch in humans, we have three great vessels. The first one is called the brachiocephalic, which means arm and head, because that vessel will branch into an artery going here to the arm. And in life, this would be sitting just underneath the clavicle, the collarbone. So we call this the subclavian, the right subclavian artery. In the armpit area, it's called the axillary artery, and as it extends onto the arm, it's called the brachial artery. And that's where your blood pressure is usually taken. But the part that goes up to the head is here, and this is the common carotid artery. The right common carotid will run up to the angle of the jaw, and there it'll fork, giving rise to an internal carotid that goes to the brain, an external carotid that runs up onto the face. Okay, so at this point we call it common carotid. Now, draining the brain, we have the jugular vein. And the vein that drains the brain is the internal jugular vein, which is fairly deep. But draining the throat, or draining the face, we have the external jugular vein, which is pretty superficial. So there is no common jugular vein because they travel separately. And they'll come together down here just above the superior vena cava. Okay?
So is that on both sides, or just the right?
And that's true on both sides.
Both sides, okay.
So occasionally you see the term brachiocephalic vein.
For the jugular or for the arm?
Where it'll actually be where the subclavian and the jugulars all come together.
Okay.
But more usually we talk about the brachiocephalic artery, and it's only on the right side. Okay? On the left side, we dig here beside the trachea, we can see the left common carotid, which again will run up here and fork into internal and external carotids. And that will be the second great vessel off the aortic arch.
So is that a lot more superficial than like humans?
The
'Cause
carotid?
it seems like it's pretty
You can
deep
palpate
in
it. You can palpate it if you reach around the trachea here.
Because it seems like it's really deep in that.
Yeah, it seems like they have more neck muscle around it here than we
Okay.
do. But it's not as superficial as the jugular.
Yeah.
Right. And the third vessel coming off the arch is the subclavian artery on the left side. So that's this left subclavian. And notice it's traveling in company with a subclavian vein. And again, this will go to an axillary region. We'll call it the axillary, brachial region. Call it the brachial. So after the three great vessels come off, the dorsal aorta then bends down through the back of the thoracic cavity, and we can see it here, coming down from the arch of the aorta, and it'll penetrate the diaphragm and show up down here in the abdominal cavity. And here it is, coming through the diaphragm. Now, in the abdominal cavity, it will give rise to what we call the splanchnic arteries. The splanchnic refers to the viscera. Okay, so these arteries are going to serve the viscera. And the first one is a median, unpaired artery that's coming straight forward from the aorta. And it's called the celiac. C-E-L-I-A-C. And the celiac artery, or trunk as it's sometimes called, branches pretty quickly into several different ones. About the first one that's going to come off is going to service the stomach and spleen. So there's the stomach, there's the spleen. And so we call that branch gastrosplenic. Another branch is going to service this rather lumpy looking organ extending here to the bend of the duodenum. And so this is the pancreatico-duodenal branch. And the third branch comes straight up through here to the biggest organ in the abdominal cavity. Liver. So we would call this the hepatic artery. Okay? Because it goes to the liver. And the hepatic artery travels in company with the bile duct and a big vein called the hepatic portal vein, which is returning all the blood from the viscera. Okay?
So there's like no, like when you mean, because like the stomach and then the intestines vein, that all goes to the liver and then the liver returns it back to the...
Right.
Okay.
So all the foodstuffs you absorb, except for lipids, right? Have to come back through the liver. And so this is probably the hepatic portal vein. It's rarely injected in these pigs unless you pay extra.
Those starring companies.
Because it's part of a portal system. Now, these viscera are all hanging in what we call the mesentery. And so the next splanchnic artery to come off from the dorsal aorta, here's our celiac, is this one. And it's called the superior mesenteric artery.
Okay.
And it's again beyond the midline and be unpaired and go to all this intestines. Okay? And right between the celiac and superior mesenteric, there's a bunch of white fibrous material. And it's a big nerve plexus called the solar plexus. Right there. Then, if we follow the aorta on down, it will give off eventually another unpaired artery here. And we call this the inferior mesenteric artery. And it just goes to the lower part of the colon and the urinary bladder.
Okay. Colon. Yep.
It's another one of those midline unpaired arteries. So there are 3 of those in the splanchnic circulation. And then between those 2, we have a pair of arteries, one going right, one left, to these organs.
Kidneys.
The kidneys. Okay. So we call that the renal artery. And it sits right beside a renal vein. The renal vein is going to have to cross over the dorsal aorta to get into the inferior vena cava, which is just always on the right side of the dorsal aorta. Okay. On the other side, I left the kidneys in their more natural position, which we described as retroperitoneal, right? So they and the aorta are behind the peritoneum.
So is the aorta always behind the peritoneum?
It's retroperitoneal.
Okay.
Too. Okay. You can kind of see what that looks like. As we get down here farther, the dorsal aorta will begin to branch and send branches into the hip area. We call this the common iliac artery. And then it will branch into femoral arteries and run down the femur and so forth. And there's usually a little single unpaired caudal artery. That's what's shown on there.
This guy?
Yeah.
Caudal.
Yeah.
And then so these are like
So
the
these are
iliacs.
common iliacs.
And
They,
this is
they fork into external and internal iliacs, and then femur.
So is this one the hepatic then? So this would be like your celiac that branches here.
That would be the superior mesenteric.
Oh, superior. That's
I guess this would be the hepatic,
Hepatic.
because that's the continuation of the celiac up towards the liver.
okay, and this could be like the
Those are going to go to
Stomach.
your stomach and spleen, and then these are going to go to your pancreas and duodenum.
spleen.
So that would be the stomach branch, that'd be the splenic, right?
Yeah.
But we'd call this little trunk gastrosplenic part of it. And then here, this could be going down to your pancreas, this can be going down to the duodenum.
Hepatic, and then this is superior mesenteric. Okay, that's really messy. I'll fix it later.
Okay. Now, but down here in the fetal pig, there's another important pair of arteries that come off the dorsal aorta. And they're running up here, just flanking a hollow vessel, which is the urinary bladder. Okay. And they're running up into this. What do you think that is? That's the umbilical cord. So remember, this is a fetal pig. So these are called the umbilical arteries, and they're returning deoxygenated blood to the umbilical cord. Well, it will travel a little ways to the placenta, pick up oxygen, come back through the cord, and then carry the oxygenated blood through this vein, the umbilical vein, which runs up into the liver. And it will shortly join the inferior vena cava and go to the heart.
Wow, so this, is it like reverse then, that your right atrium is actually pumping like
In this case,
deoxygenated or oxygenated blood?
Yes.
Wow.
So oxygenated blood from the inferior vena cava is actually mixing with some deox blood from the head.
Huh. Wow.
But the pig's not that active right now.
Yeah.
And there's no point sending blood to the lungs because they're just full of fluid. So we have two shortcuts. The first shortcut is underneath this pulmonary artery, there's a connection between the left atrium and the right atrium and the left atrium.
Mm-hmm.
And that connection is called the oval window or foramen ovale. And it's open. So blood from the right atrium can go right into the left side and out to the body. The other connection is right here where the pulmonary trunk crosses the dorsal aorta. There's a little duct running between, and that's called the ductus arteriosus. And it allows blood being squirted out from the right ventricle to go out to the system. So we pretty much bypass the whole pulmonary circulation.
My phone quit on me.
Battery?
No, I don't have
Connection.
storage.
Oh no.
Oh well.
Yeah, it's
Storm
probably been a
has
pretty
it.
long day. We're just about done though.
Okay.
Okay. So at birth, those will close off. The foraminal valve closes off with a membrane thinner than this.
Wow.
But there's low pressure in the atria anyway, so it's usually not an issue.
Oh, that was the worst.
And even if it doesn't close off, it's not a huge issue. There'll be some mixing of oxygenated and deoxygenated
Left,
blood, right?
right, left, right.
But in most cases, if a child is born with that congenital defect, we'll just kind of take a wait-and-see approach to that. But much more serious is the defect called patent ductus arteriosus. If that remains open, you have high-pressure blood from the aorta squirting into the pulmonary circuit.
And that's the one that was option C that we put on the last test when it was supposed to be option A.
Yes.
And
Or on the test.
you
The-
don't want
whatever it
that
was.
Yeah.
because that high pressure in the pulmonary capillaries leads to edema in the lungs, right? So that's something, if a newborn shows that defect, it's going to be surgically repaired. What happens sometimes in newborns is called the tetralogy of Fallot, which is 4 defects at once.
Oh gosh.
Major heart operation.
Yeah.
So is that
And
like
that can include interventricular septal wall defects too.
okay? So like I know like in like Down syndrome, kids with Down syndrome.
Down syndrome kids
what-
are more subject to these cardiac
Okay. Is there like a
myopathies.
specific one, or is it?
It can be any one
Any
of
of them? Okay.
Yeah. So the last thing to show on here is if we move the viscera aside, we see this is a female. And there's a little ovary here. And there was an oviduct here leading to the ovary from a funnel-like opening here in the wall of the peritoneal cavity. Because the eggs are actually released into the peritoneal fluid, find their way into the funnel, and go down into, ultimately, the uterus. And this squiggly stuff are arms of the uterus. Now, our uterus doesn't have as many arms. It has more body than arms. Okay. But these 2 arms come together into the body of the uterus and then onto the vagina, which is behind the urinary bladder. But there is a ovarian artery here running from up here. And in the human, that artery actually branches off of the renal artery. Because in embryonic development, the uterus begins up there, close to the kidneys, and then migrates down. And so the artery just falls.
So where is the uterus on this page, or is it not really?
Well, you can see the arms of the uterus.
Okay.
So mammals like this have what we call a bicornate uterus.
Fallopian tubes.
The equivalent of fallopian tubes is actually the oviduct,
And where's the ovary?
right there.
So does it like go up and then back down?
The eggs in
oviduct?
this case have to go up into the funnel, back down the oviducts, and into the uterus.
Okay. Weird.
Okay. Now, in a mature woman, the infundibulum, which is the funnel leading to the oviduct, actually sits much closer to the uterus. But it's still possible for eggs to wander out and implant into the abdominal cavity anywhere.
I'm reaching my max. Was there anything else we needed to include for Mac? Were there any more artery?
Well, let me show one more thing here. If we look at our male, here's the testes down in the scrotum.